Part 2. So quiet that house was in the night, so quiet all the other little homes around it were that held the elderly in them, and the old, alone or still in couples, sleeping early, waking, lying awake, and thinking about the past. So much past every night, in the silence settling over those houses, that all looked much the same on a hillside creeping up against the rock and gorse, and tripping down to the river where it widened, and ended in the sea. "We went from village to village," said Mr. Mercer in the dark. "We had a map to start with, but it soon gave out. We asked the way. Sometimes we had a guide from place to place. We had one when it happened, funnily enough. To be honest," said Mr. Mercer, "I was a wee bit jealous of him." "You mean she flirted?" Mrs. Mercer asked. "I mean, they had the language, and I was only learning still and couldn't always follow. They laughed a lot. They made some jokes I couldn't understand. Also, they went ahead a bit more than they needed to, perhaps. Or perhaps I let them. Perhaps I lagged behind on purpose and let them go ahead. I don't know why. We were on a path around a slippery purple rock, and the glacier on the right of us below. They were laughing. I must have let them go ahead. Then the path went around the rock face left, and they were out of sight. Last sound but one I heard from her was laughter when she was already out of sight, and the very last, her scream. When I got there, she'd gone, and the guide was looking down. His face was dirty yellow, I remember." "Was she a blonde?" Mrs. Mercer asked. "No," said Mr. Mercer. "Her hair was black." "I thought she'd be blonde," said Mrs. Mercer, "being German." "No," said Mr. Mercer. "I told you when I told you the whole story her hair was like yours, black." "Like mine," said Mrs. Mercer. Wednesday was library day. "Same again," said Mr. Mercer. His hands were trembling. He had a scared look. "Same sort of thing," said Mrs. Mercer. "Mind how you go." "Whatever is in there, behind the eyes, or around the heart, or whatever else it is, whatever it is that is not the husk of us, will cease when the husk does, but in the meantime never ages, does it? Explain him otherwise, his agitation when he thinks of Katya in the ice, her bodily warmth and merriment, night after night, as Mrs. Mercer, in the wooden houses, among flowers in the snow, comes up in him. An old man near the end inhabits him as thoroughly as does his renewing blood. Sweet first girl, sweet unimaginable shock of the simple sight of her the first time without her clothes. "What am I going to do about it?" he asks himself aloud. "Nothing. What can I do?" At dinner time he said, "This global warming." "What about it?" Mrs. Mercer said. "I read some more about it in the library in a magazine." "I've read the book you brought me, by the way," Mrs. Mercer said. "Sorry," he said. "They're very worried in Switzerland especially. Where's all the water going? The glaciers are melting, but the water's not come down yet. They think it's waiting like a dam." "I see," said Mrs. Mercer. "They fear it will all come down at once one day." "Very likely," said Mrs. Mercer. Then she said, "When you tell me she's still where she fell, does that mean people can see her if they go and look?" "Yes," said Mr. Mercer. "That's what the letter said. Still there, apparently, just the way she was, 20, in the dress of that day and age. She'll come down when the waters break, with mud and rocks, and anything human in the way of it will be wiped out. But we shall be dead by then, and turning in our own clay on the earth. In the night, in the utter silence of the nights among those little houses where old people live, she felt him leave the bed, and in the pitch black reach his dressing gown and leave the room. She let him go. How it troubled her, all this. Not much to ask. Peace of mind at nights and a bit of ordinary cheerfulness in the day. Some conversation, something to laugh about, and doing nobody any harm, and not all this. A slit of light came on under the bedroom door. She heard him fishing about above his head with the stick, tap, tap, for the hook to fetch the trap-door down and the ladder on it to mount into the loft. He'll break his neck. But she heard the steps creak and the gasps of his exertion as he got up there. He'll freeze to death. How cold it was in the space under the roof above their little living space, bitter cold and draughty, where they stored the past, its bulk and minutiae, in boxes, parcels, bags, on sagging shelves, in hidey-holes, diminishing with the rafters. She heard him on the ceiling above the bed, rooting around, the slithering of cartons, heard the efforts, then silence. She slept, woke in a sudden terror over his absence still, stood in her nightie at the foot of the ladder, cold even there, calling up to him till finally he showed himself, wrapped up and shivering, without his teeth, leaning over the hole, his face a blue-grey with the cold and grief. He leaned down over the hole above her upturned face, its halo of thin silver hair, and tried to say, "Nothing to worry about," but couldn't, and made a gibbering noise. The photos clutched two-handed against his heart. He slept late and shuffled in without a shave. His hand was shaking. She poured his tea. "That's enough now," she said. "Yes," he said, but asked could she remember where she had put the big atlas. "I just want to look," he said. "Under the sofa, since it was more wide than fat. And my boots," he said. "I beg your pardon?" "My boots. But those aren't the ones. No, but I always bought the same." She thought they might be in the shed, under the old fish tank. "That stick I brought back might be in there as well," he said. "I dare say," said Mrs. Mercer. "And will you make an appointment and get something to quiet you down?" He had found the photos and a book of hers he was carrying for her in his rucksack when she went ahead with the guide and out of sight fell down through the snow into a crack in the glacier. It was a book of poems in Gothic script, with a Nazi eagle stamped on the inside cover. In the pages were some gentians, flat and nearly black, but blue if you looked long enough, an eternal blue. In the photographs she was just as she was, slim in a long skirt, smiling, her black hair in a curve around her cheek. The white mountains were behind. The paths she stood on to be photographed often looked vertiginous, but were safe enough in reality, until the last one. They were heading south, more or less, trying to find a way into Italy, as she said she had always wanted to do. Her idea was there would be a last big climb, up very high, where it would be hard to get your breath, and after that all the streams would run the other way, and they would run down with them, getting warmer and warmer through an unbelievable profusion of flowers, and before long they would see the vines, and that would be Italy. But some days they forgot where they were going, and if a place was nice, they stayed. "One thing I didn't tell you," Mr. Mercer said the next morning, after a quieter night, though sleepless mostly, open-eyed and thinking. "Oh," said Mrs. Mercer, "you made an appointment to the doctor's, I hope." "Yes," he said, "this afternoon. I was thinking in the night, one thing I never told you. Never told anyone come to that, not a living soul. Nobody ever knew. I'm the only one in the world who knows it even now. Only one alive, I mean." "Well," said Mrs. Mercer. "She was going to have a baby, my Katya was." More and more slowly, Mrs. Mercer went on with her toast and homemade damps and jam. He sat, turning over his empty hands. His face, she knew, had she confronted it, was looking at her, with its puzzled and pleading look, the eyes behind the glasses rather washed out. "I suppose I thought it might upset you at the time." "I see," she said, after a while, when her mouth had given up trying to eat. "I suppose you would think that." Then she took her own things to the draining board and left him sitting there with his. They parted company, ate together, slept together, but were in separate circles. Almost at once, as though it were beyond his failing strength, he gave up pitying his wife and fell back down the decades into the couple of months of a summer in the Alps. Between thinking and muttering he went to and fro, up and down, never knew which he was in, and in her company, face to face over another meal, or side by side on a walk to the post office, addressed her or himself. "I wonder where you would put that big medical dictionary. It wasn't with the Cassells behind the jars. In the loft, perhaps?" The ladder to the loft was permanently down, encumbering the way into the little living room. A breath of cold hung over the opening, or the warmth of their living space, being drawn up there, was converted into cold just above their heads. He was often up there, rooting around. In the mechanism of her love and duty, she called him down when his meal was on the table. But also at nights he went up there, and she heard him moving and muttering over the bedroom ceiling. Then she wept herself to sleep for the unfairness. Surely to God it wasn't much to ask, that you get through to the end, and looking back, you don't fill with horror and disappointment and hopeless wishful thinking. All she wanted was to be able to say, it hasn't been nothing. It hasn't been a waste of time. The 50 years, that they amount to something, if not a child, a something made and grown between man and wife you could be proud of, and nearly as substantial as a child. And now all this, him burrowing back through all the layers, him rooting through all their accumulations to get back to where he wanted to be in the time before she was. Once, with a bitterness that twisted her mouth as if the question were vinegar, she asked, "How far gone was she?" 6 weeks, Mr. Mercer answered. "We worked it out. It would be about 6 weeks. The fetus at 6 weeks is a tiny thing, hung in the mother like a creature in hibernation. The medical dictionary was in the loft, in that very cramped place where the eaves came down behind a sort of false wall made of hardboard. But Mr. Mercer found it finally, and in it a picture of the fetus at 6 weeks, and sat there under the bare bulb like an adolescent staring at it. What struck him most when he thought about him and Katya was their heedlessness. That was the word that came to him. We were heedless, because really, if it was bad where we were leaving, which was Bavaria, it was not much better where we were heading, which was Italy. And up there in the snow, the minute we set off, what did we do but go and get a baby? Heedless. For obviously we should have come down again sooner or later, out of the sharp air, the flowers, and the snow, and face up to our responsibilities in a bad world getting worse.